it wasn't all, and we were struggling, you know, when you left school, you know, people were struggling to get jobs. But, you know, the ignorance comes in many forms. For the fact that you had to wait, you couldn't just email somebody or send a WhatsApp and say, could somebody do that?
Hello, welcome to an episode of With Nyasha Michelle. I am so grateful to all you guys who come week after week to watch or to listen, and not just to me, but to the fantastic guests that I have on the show. And today, the guest that I have is one who has inspired me. One who has paved the way, not just for me, but so many people, and has made a difference, which I don't even really know if she knows she's done that. So I had to reach out to her and just say, please, come on to my podcast. And I thought she was not going to say yes. But when she said yes, I was pleasantly surprised and very, very thrilled. So guys, without further ado, I am going to introduce you to a phenomenal journalist, a broadcaster, a storyteller who's been doing what she does best for more than 3 decades. It's Bola Mosuro. How are you?
I'm fine, Nyasha. Thank you very much. That was very sweet.
No,
very sweet introduction. Thank you.
It came from the heart because I remember when you left BBC. We're going to go straight into it, guys. I met you, of course, at BBC. And I remember when you left, I was in South Africa, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, because they did a whole video of yours and then they filmed it. And then I was just like, gosh, I wish I was there because I wanted to be part of that. Because really and truly, the more time went after you left, the more I realized, my gosh, sometimes people make a difference in your life and you don't realize that they have.
Oh.
Yeah. So we're going to look at all of that or talk about all of that in a moment. But of course, as I said to the people, you're a broadcaster, you're a journalist. But there is a question before we get to all of that that I ask all my guests when they first start, which is, what is one defining moment that set you on the path that you're on today?
Ooh. Yeah, you know, the funny thing, I don't think there's been a defining moment. I think it was a build-up of different things.
Yeah.
Because I've always been involved in storytelling or information dissemination of some sort. Like growing up, I worked in a library, in my local library. Then I worked in the House of Commons library when I was younger. Yeah, that was one of my first jobs. Then I worked as information officer for an organisation called Institute for African Alternatives. And then I came to the BBC. So information and sharing information has always been part of my story. It's just the broadcasting element. But then even that, when I was younger, I have a tape. Well, my mum taped something when I was about 8.
Yeah.
And it was of me. She asked me to give a report about something we were doing in school. I found it recently on cassette. It was back in the day. For those of you that don't know what cassettes are, yeah, a lot of people saying cassette, what's that? But and she recorded it on a cassette deck, and I was talking about my day in school or a project we were doing. So I guess I've always, you know, had this inkling or this desire to tell stories.
Wow.
And but then coming to the BBC, I worked on the magazine first of all. And I wasn't in front of the mic. I wasn't, you know, I was working as an editorial assistant on the magazine, Focus on Africa magazine, that is, for those that don't know, which sadly is no more. And I worked for a department called the Talks Unit. And that's how I started off. And then gradually, after a couple of years, I started getting behind the mic. And
Wow.
Continued from there.
It was meant to be then. It sounds like your mother recorded you saying something when you were 8 years old. Do you remember what you were saying? Do you remember the actual experience?
Only because I listened to it recently. And I was, and at one stage I kind of told her off because she was copying me My mum has a lovely sense of humor, and she was copying me, and I was saying, "Oh, don't do that, mummy." And then I would launch back into like a retake.
Yeah.
You know how you'd so I'd start saying, and in school we have this project, which is the so about 3 times I kind of took it again. And I thought, oh, that's a bit strange, but I kind of
mean, you were
obviously knew to
8.
start from but anyway, yeah,
Wow.
that was it.
So tell me about your childhood then.
So I was raised both in Nigeria and so both in Lagos and in London. So started off in London. I was born in London. Then when I was about still in primary school, we went to Nigeria, and I went to Command Children's School, which is like an army children's school.
Oh,
even though we
gosh.
had no army connections.
You know, I actually went to one
Did
in Zimbabwe.
you?
Yeah.
Tough.
It was tough.
Very tough.
Yeah.
But
they
was
were-
yours boarding or was yours
No,
day?
it was day.
Okay, mine was day as well.
Yeah, I
But
think-
for the secondary school, they had it's like the Navy school and they have military schools. They're even tougher. And I still had an easy time of it because I was at home. But my siblings, I have an elder brother and sister, just 3 years between my brother, who's the eldest, and my sister, who's 2 years older. They went straight to boarding school. And they went to boarding school in our hometown, which is Odogbolu, which is in Ogun State. And they really had a tough time because it was, you get there, you have to take a hoe, you would start doing agricultural work, in your spare time. You would till the land, this was back in the 70s. So to have a bath, you would fetch your water, you would, have your bath in a communal shower. So it was all of that. Whereas I was at home. So I kind of had the cushy end of things, yeah. So I went to Army Children's School, Command Children's School as it was then. This was in Yaba, in Sabo, and then which is part of Lagos. And then I went to Holy Child College, which is a Catholic girls' school. And I started my secondary schooling there, also in Lagos Island in Ikoyi. And then I finished my secondary school back in London, came back to London and went to Hornsey School for Girls in North London. And then went to uni in Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland. Well, you've had quite a plethora of different cultures and experiences just between those bits of countries. But what was it like then, if you were in between? What was it like when you'd come from the UK and then go to Nigeria, and then when you'd come from Nigeria and you come back to the UK?
Yeah, it's funny. It's I guess that's what, how they say we all code switch.
Yes.
I say we all, but as black people and many people of different cultures, when you're in UK, you code switch. So I think I mastered code switching quite early, in Nigeria, going to Nigeria. First of all, I remember they used to call me Oyibo Pepe. They would call anybody who came from, because you're Johnny just come, you just landed in Lagos, you talk with as people say, smeh accent,
These words, Oyibo Pepe.
I'm telling you everything, so it toughened me up as well because, you had to be tough to abuse because, our people, I mean, sometimes it was just leg pulling, but sometimes it could go one step further. And children can be very, very cruel.
They can be mean.
So in Nigeria, I was initially teased and then kind of hardened. And then, and also my Yoruba wasn't so hot when we went to Nigeria. Even now, it's not perfect, I have to admit. But, gradually I learned Yoruba. But so I was teased quite a bit then. And then after a while, I was just one of the guys. Then coming back to the UK, then it was the other way around that, I came back with a bit of a Nigerian accent. So, people would tease you, things that you wouldn't think, I don't know, maybe things, fashion, maybe not even fashion-wise. I just get culturally, it was very different coming back to the UK at the time. But then, after a while. But as I say, code switching helps. Because, you learn to change your accent depending on...
Yeah.
I mean, we all do it without even realising
And
we're
it's
doing
crazy,
it.
though, that we're still doing it. Yeah. But before we don't need to get
That's
into
a
all
whole
of that.
new- yeah, that's a whole
Exactly.
different... Yeah.
I want to know about you. So I've had the experience of coming from Africa and just, moving to the UK to do school, right? And of course, all of the experiences that you've mentioned. But that was in like 2000s. What was it like back then for you being a young black girl in Britain?
It was tough. I mean, it was tough, but then you also had... I mean, maybe it was... different for me because I also lived in North London. North London is the part I lived in. We lived in Hornsey first, then we moved. Well, it was all around Hornsey, then Turnpike Lane area, Wood Green. But in Hornsey, it's very multicultural. The schools I went to were multicultural. So in that sense, you had that sense of belonging. You didn't feel completely like a fish out of water like some of my cousins did, who maybe went to school in, boarding school in maybe Hertfordshire or somewhere in Sussex, and they were one of only 2 or 3, children, African children or Nigerian children at the time. For me, it was slightly different, but it was also at a time in the 1980s when we had quite a lot of racial tension. We had riots. There were riots in Toxteth, riots in Brixton. There were, and it was during the time of the sus laws, where young boys could be stopped on suspicion of, I say young boys, young black youth.
Yep.
We could be stopped. So there was quite a bit of tension. But at the same time, there was also homogeneity with it was kind of, you also had, there were contrasts.
Yeah.
But yeah, it wasn't easy at the time, but it also you just did.
You did it.
Do you know what I
did
mean?
it. Yeah. And what I do want to focus on, though, is the Black joy. What was it? What are some of the positives of growing up in the UK in the 80s, the 90s? Because I was still in Africa back then. And what I've also realized is that when it comes to Black history, I've seen a lot more of what America has gone through, the evolution of America. Of course, I know about my country. I was there. Anything I want to know about, I speak to my parents. You know what I mean? But what was Black Britain like?
God, that's such a broad question. It's such a broad, but at the same, we had Black joy. Music, culture, just fashion, and the reason why I say this kind of a crossover when it's not that it wasn't that it was such a melting pot that everybody was, but maybe in the same way it is now. But we had. I remember when I was in secondary school, and you had a group called the Casuals, and they wore Burberry coats. Black and white girls had hair which was kind of like a bob but flicked on the side.
Okay.
This was kind of a bit pre-Princess Diana, but you had kind of a flick. And so the black girls, if they had relaxed hair, would flick their hair. You had cornrows. We had pride in the way but music was, the clubs we went to, the club scene in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of crossover. So because a lot of us who came from Nigeria, either came to secondary school or came straight to university, and the clubs were, fantastic, Gulliver's. There were clubs in Berkeley Square. Some people like the Hippodrome, some people like Café de Paris, some people just like going to house parties. House parties were big. This was also in the days of pirate radio, so you had pirate radio stations. Kiss FM was just starting. You had somebody called Trevor Mad Hatter, I remember, started off with Martin Mad Hatter, and they used to have kind of started underground and then had, parties in Camden.
Yeah.
We used to go to a lot of parties, and groups of us, you'd always meet together in the same, but the music was fantastic. And some of the artists are still going strong. Some of them are still going strong. You have, whether Misha Paris, Omar, on the British, scene, if you're into your R&B, Estelle started a bit later on, but music was fantastic.
Oh, I love
It
that.
was, we enjoyed. We enjoyed, and I still like my music today.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you enjoyed because the way you smile.
Music was my thing. Music and food, but music was my thing.
Yeah.
We loved going out to that. My sister was very much into house music. So Ministry of Sound started a bit later, and she loved going to Ministry of Sound. You couldn't get her off the dance floor, but it was, that was the beginning of house music, and
Yeah. It's good to hear that, because like I say, That's why some of the documentaries and the exhibitions that have happened in the UK in recent years are very important. Some people may not have that case, but when I've really looked at it, I've realized I don't know as much about like the history of Black Britain. And so to have someone like you and to just go relive it through what you experienced.
But I mean, you did
cool.
ask about the Black joy. So,
Yes.
and it's sometimes I think we also bury the negativity and the negative, but there was a lot of racial tension as well, and as I say, there were riots. So it wasn't all, and we were struggling, when you left school, people were struggling to get jobs, struggling to, nothing has changed now, but, it's still, but specifically you asking about the Black joy. We had good times.
Yeah. The reason why I wanted to ask about the Black joy was because I think we speak, essentially, it's not even complicated. I wanted to focus on the positives.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
I
wanted
like
to
that.
focus
I
on the positives.
I like that.
Because I know there's a lot that happened, even some of the things, the riots that you mentioned. I know about them from reading Black authors' books. It was not something that when I came into school here, we were taught about. And I guess also being a journalist as well, I feel like a lot of some of the news that I've like consumed and I've read, it's always like somewhat negative. And I know that there's such a rich history, especially of you also being African. That's another key thing for me as well. Because when it comes to, for example, my parents' generation, they all came from Africa. They weren't born here. So to have the perspective of someone like you who was born and raised here, and then you went to the different.
But then I had the mixture of both. So it was nice that I was born here, but also lived back home in Nigeria. So I had both.
Yeah.
I straddled both British culture and Nigerian culture, and the groups I mixed with, I was quite fluid for mixing with, Black Britons, English kids who are from, Pakistan, Guadeloupe, France, we were so so we had a nice group of friends who, the crossover was quite easy. Yeah.
And then if we get into what you do as a journalist, you're still a storyteller. Yeah, you're still a storyteller. Then how did you get into journalism then? You kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, just the fact that you were just always good with like communication and telling stories, I guess.
Yeah, so when working at the BBC, I started off in the World Service. As I say, though, I had worked in libraries beforehand as an information officer, and part of that was an element of journalism, writing. It was mostly on development work, so it was IMF, mostly structural adjustment programs and how that affects us, particularly how it affected it was Institute for African Alternatives.
Yeah.
So it was always talking about that. And, luckily I managed to travel a little bit with IFA, as it was called then. That was in the very early 90s. And then I started in the World Service, in the African Service. And, almost immediately, I think once you start, even as an editorial assistant, an element of that, even though I wasn't there as a producer, I started as an editorial assistant, but you still had the joy of being able to put stories together. You were contributing to the storytelling, even if you weren't the main person, who was writing these stories. And then gradually, I thought, no, I do want to, I had, how you always hope that you can make an inroad in a particular area, and that once you get in, you can then make your way up. Sometimes it takes longer than you expect.
Yeah.
So I started as an editorial assistant, hoping that within a year I'd be on air. Within a year I'd be, producing or doing something, and it took a bit longer than that. But I still was able to, so I started freelancing even whilst doing my editorial assistant work. And any opportunity I had around, to go to an event in London, it was, in the early 90s, it was fantastic. It was, because we all knew each other. It was the media space and the art space was, one that it was quite a family. Sometimes it was a bit, I wouldn't say incestuous, but sometimes, everybody knew everybody
Everyone knew,
else.
yeah.
Yeah. And so sometimes it could get a bit cliquey.
Mm.
And certain people, it's not so much that they were gatekeepers, but certain people, if you weren't, and it's still the same now.
I was about to say, it's
There's
still kind of like that
There are
sometimes.
certain groups that, you would try and, just to do a story, it's not that you're trying to get pally with them, but they might not necessarily give you an audience. But on the whole, it was a lovely atmosphere. It was nice. We all kind of knew, a lot of people knew each other. Literature would cross over into the arts, into music, into, that kind of thing, and journalism. And so I would go to a lot of events around London, and if I could, outside London, just to work as a freelancer. And I would then, have those stories put on Focus on Africa or Network Africa. Network Africa was my main thing. If I could get a story on air. And then after a while I said, you know what, I don't just want to report. I would like to get behind the mic. I was given an opportunity I started with Postmark Africa. This was it was a question and answer program where listeners would, and given that our listenership in the African service was massive. We had the biggest audience in the world service in the 90s, and even I would argue now it's still probably one of the largest, maybe not the largest, I'm not sure.
So
I don't know how the figures have changed. Anyway, but at the time, the African service was the largest. People would write from all over the continent and even outside. Back in those days, it wasn't just sending an email. They would send letters. People would write a letter, maybe 2 weeks later it would get to you in the office. We had when I say sacks, Nyasha.
Wow.
Sacks of letters. Yeah.
Wow.
And people would write and they would say, I want to know how attachments are made. I want to know how sound travels from a microphone into earphone. They could ask anything and everything. And we as producers and as presenters would go out and find the stories and put them together. So in the half-hour program, you could maybe cover 6 subjects. And it was just nice because it was on a variety of subjects and you never knew but you would pick the story and then you would, make sure it was animated in some way. You would get how do birds sing. You would find the sound of a bird, and and then you would get somebody from the science unit, or you go to the Natural History Museum and interview somebody there. Those were always the best when you could actually travel and interview somebody, an expert, and that was it. So that's how I started. Then I started on Network Africa. After a few, started on Network Africa presenting. And we had a kind of stable of about 4 to 5 of us. So I was on with, when I was really doing it, I was on with Hassan Oni.
Wow.
Max Bankole Jarrett. Paul Bachibinga was also one of our presenters. Joseph Walungu. Audrey Brown was more on Focus at the time. And then later we had so many others like Peter Okwache, and at the time, other people on Focus were like Maureen Kamdunde. I don't know if you know Maureen. And Toko Moyo. So many. There have been so many presenters who've come. But anyway, I was on Network Africa as one of the regular presenters, and I loved it.
Wow.
Loved it.
Wow, wow. I mean, just hearing you talk, I'm here imagining how it was like. What was the atmosphere like? And what I want to ensure is I take you guys with us, and we don't lose you people because I'm just fascinated, so I might.
I'm sorry, I talk a lot.
No, you're fine. Because the thing is, conversations like this, I think are very needed because people like me who've come after you, we need to hear this. And then there's so many others as well, in particular, Black journalists or even just Black people who want to be journalists. And if I put it in a bit more context, journalism is my second career. And I used to do something completely different. And then I used to live in America. I came back and then I was like, oh, I don't want to do this, what I was doing before, right? And then I discovered now that this is what I want to do. The way I struggled to pivot into the industry was diabolical. And this is recent, technically. This is like 2016. And I'm like, I can't find the access into the industry. And also, it's very difficult to really get to know and to find Black journalists. Now, I think one of the reasons as well was because I was still quite fresh in the country, I would say, having spent most of my young, adult life traveling and living abroad. But nonetheless, I was so shocked, Bola, at the fact that, well, where are our people? You know? So I ended up having to do a master's. I've always wanted to do a master's, so I ended up doing that. And then that was my inroad into the BBC. So for you, hearing your story and how things were like for you, it's encouraging, and that's why I'm like, okay, I want us to have this conversation. But anyways, there's so many different questions that I have. So because once I got into it, you were one of the pioneering already presenters, and not just for Focus on Africa. You were a Newsday, and you done so many documentaries. You sat down with incredible people. How did you end up getting there, and what were some of the challenges that you had experienced?
I mean, it's interesting when you talk about, inspiration, because we all, we follow in other people's footsteps, and we all stand on other people's shoulders,
yeah.
And before I started working at the World Service, as I say, I was working at the House of Commons Library, a totally different world from the World Service, from the African service in particular. And even when you think of the BBC, it's quite interesting for people in this country. Many people don't know about the World Service in the UK.
Yeah.
So the World Service, even when I started, was known more outside of the UK than it was by people here. But at the time, I guess because I was working at IFA, I had a lot of connections to African NGOs, African organizations. I was a board member of a women's group called Akina Mamawa Africa, which is a Pan-African women's group based here in the UK, and it was development oriented. And so I'd already had a lot of tentacles in the community. But I looked up to journalists like Elizabeth Ohini, who was the deputy editor of Focus. And she used to have a column in the back of Focus on Africa magazine. And I would religiously, every time it came out, I would go to the back just to see her column, because she writes in a specific way. She has, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's she doesn't take prisoners, and she's just a fantastic journalist. And I used to, love what she did. There used to be, when I was younger, an organization, a newspaper called African Times and Caribbean Times. And I think, did they have Asian Times? I'm not sure. And it was run by Hansib Publications, and it was in Finsbury Park. And a friend of mine, my best friend at the time, was working at Hansib. So I kind of knew about some of the black newspapers. Also, The Voice was there. A bit later on, there was another black newspaper called The New Nation. So you kind of knew who the black journalists were. Josephine Hazley worked in Caribbean Times. So I got to know her as a print journalist before I got to know her as a radio journalist. So I looked to people like that. And when I got to the World Service, I mean, there were fantastic role models like Ophebia Christarkton. Was a woman who, I mean, she's a fantastic journalist. And when Ophebia just has this way with words, it's lyrical, a bit like Elizabeth Ahini. People like that I looked up to. So in the same way that you, and I'm honoured that you say it, looked up to myself and I guess Audrey and other people, I looked to them, and I looked to them not just to see how they did things, but also just to see them, just to have that representation, and to know that these are people on the continent, even if here didn't get the props they were due. Back home, these people were and still are rock stars.
Yeah, definitely.
And it was
household names.
Completely. And it's something that people here don't seem to realize, even amongst our own people in our own community. But you go back home and you say Nyasha Michelle, and people say, oh, yeah. And yet you say it in your area in London, and people might say, who? And so that was, inspiring for me, but also just to see the stories that we were doing. So I'm not quite sure that I answered your question,
No,
but
no,
I mean,
it's
these were, when I started, it was wonderful also to know, I think for me, what I think turned it for me was knowing that I could speak to people.
Yeah.
And that's why I loved Network Africa, because this immediacy you would get, that you would follow stories, do stories on development, on politics, on culture, and people gave you the feedback. They
Yeah.
would write to you. They would, I said we started with snail mail, then you started getting text. Then after text, we started getting email. People would give you feedback, and you knew you were on the right track. And if they didn't like you, they'd also tell you as well. But yeah, so
How did you ever deal with it, assuming that you ever had this, when someone maybe said, oh, I didn't like this or I didn't like that? How did you deal with that?
yeah, nobody nobody likes criticism. It
Yeah.
depends what they were complaining about. If they were complaining about a story, you would have to defend
Your story
your
and how you did
story
it.
and how you
Yeah.
did it and why. I mean, you're not going to please everybody. I think we pride ourselves, and I wouldn't say we pride ourselves still to this day to be objective. That is our, our whole mantra, that you have to give every side to a story, but you have to be objective, you have to be fair. So hopefully I would stand by it. But when we got things wrong, you have to put your hand up and say, yeah, I got this wrong. However, if it then is a personal attack, that's something totally different. And I
Completely.
still to this day, I can't do. That's why, even podcasting, even social media to an extent, putting yourself out on Instagram or on Twitter was easier, I found. Then, before it became X, Twitter was easier because with the 140 characters, you could say what you wanted, and that was it. But I find Instagram, because I think it's so much to do with pictures
Visuals,
and
yeah.
visuals, that it's kind of harder to. But now that's the only.
It's like if
Twitter
you
and
ain't on the
LinkedIn are the
shows,
only
socials,
things, and
yeah.
even then I don't dabble much, and I've never really been a Facebook person, and I do apologize to all my Facebook followers. I have quite
I was
a
about to
few,
say, you
and
must have some.
yeah, I do, but unfortunately I'm really lousy with Facebook. I I sincerely am. If you're out there and you followed me on Facebook and you've written messages to me and I haven't responded, please, I beg your forgiveness. Really, I don't know what it is about Facebook. It's just never, yeah.
It's never really been,
I found
me.
it intrusive, and I've just found it, and yet, yeah, I don't know why. It
Yeah.
I never clicked.
Okay. Well, if you have any messages or questions for Bola, which she never answered when you slid into her Facebook DM, just put them in the comments, and I promise I'll get them to her.
Yeah, now I realize that, yeah, I think it's just with Facebook. I think it's just the weight of it. I think there's a lot on Facebook. Whereas with Instagram, I think it's kind of, you can be quicker with your, I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's just a perception. Yeah.
Fair enough. I do want to tap into, even though you guys did some pioneering things with World Service, with BBC World Service, I can't imagine it was easy. So what was some of the challenges that you had to that you dealt with, and how did you navigate them?
I think back in the day, I mean, remember we were in the era prior to mobile phones being so readily available, and you being able to use your mobile phone to capture a story, in the sense that now everybody can be a journalist. You have so many citizen journalists, which maybe isn't necessarily, is maybe a drawback to the current journalism. But we didn't have things coming in real time, so we had to wait a lot of the time for information. When I started at the World Service, we used to have telexes.
What?
When I started, yeah,
What's
exactly,
that?
telex and faxes. So our stories our stories would come in via a telex machine. I mean, that was, it had started dying out by the time I got there. But faxes, definitely. Our stories would come. I remember there was a reporter we had in Algeria, Alex Himer. And he used to send his stories via fax. And not only would he send it via fax, it was in French. So he'd get the fax, Somebody would translate it into English, and then we'd put it on.
Oh my gosh.
So it was also harder back in the day because to verify a story, you'd have to get your two sources.
I was going to ask
So
that.
for the fact that you had to wait, you couldn't just email somebody or send a WhatsApp and say, could somebody do that? You couldn't. You had to phone somebody, and then the phone lines weren't so easy. This was prior to. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about. This was in the early 90s, so you would have to wait for somebody. Sometimes the phone connection wasn't there, or your reporter had to travel. I mean, our reporters back then were fantastic.
Must have been.
My
because
God.
there's a lot that they had to navigate in
God.
order to bring the news.
They would travel, and some people who didn't have cars would take, public transport in order to go to a business center to file their stories. They would file it via text, or they would file it via fax, or they would then send a telex. All the manner in which people reported their stories, it was just, and then we would then, transcribe them. When I started as well, we started with tape. So we had physical tape. So the cassette tape that I was talking about. But as a journalist, you had reel to reel. So we had Voxes, Revox machines. And I don't know if you've seen them. They're like big. They're the size of a record, of a 33 record.
Okay, yeah.
Do you know what a 30? Do you know what an LP is? Are you old enough to know? Oh God.
No.
I know. Player
when
record.
when you said record though, I thought it's that black thing, the one that you put in
it is, but I'm saying the size of a record.
Yes.
The size of a record was the size of one reel. And on this Revox machine, you could have two reels. Sometimes you'd have the small ones, sometimes you'd have the big ones. But when you were editing, you would have, so like, let's say you'd have a small size of 45. You would record on the tape, and when you're editing, you would cut the tape. So if you're listening to, now when you're listening to a report, you would listen, you would edit something digitally, and you would maybe put it in the recycle bin. If you then think, oh, actually, I want to put that back, you could still take it back. No, then you had to physically cut the tape, and you would cut the tape and you would stick. If it was a sentence... You're looking confused.
Gosh, I am like, wait, what?
If it was a story that you were doing, and I said the dog is blue, and I was supposed to say the dog is brown, and then I would repeat the phrase again. I would cut out the dog is blue and chuck it. But let's say there was something in that sentence that I wanted to keep. You would cut out that little bit, put it to the side, and when you're putting your sentence together again,
patch it together.
And we did it with something called the China graph. It was either white or yellow, and you would mark it on the tape. You would see it clearly because the tape was brown, and then you'd put it together. Sometimes if you were you imagine making a package.
I was about to ask you,
making
how long
a documentary.
Did that take? Oh my gosh!
You could have sentences, and you would stick it to the wall. And I used to write. I mean, mine may have not been the most effective, but you would write. I would write what that sentence was or what that was, and then stick it on the wall. I wasn't alone in doing that. Or you stick it on the Revox machine, and then you became quite quick. You imagine you're on air. It's a live program, and you have to cut something because they say, "Oh, we're running over time." As you know, in radio speak, you're running over time, so you have to cut. Focus on Africa. Network Africa is live on air. We realize we've got 5 items, but one of them has to now be reduced from 5 minutes to 3:50. You would have to remember what part of that interview needed to be cut. And whilst the program is still on air, you would go to the back of the room. It was C33 in Bush House. You would go to the back of the studio, and you would basically be cutting the tape, and you would put it together. That's how we started. But the adrenaline would pump.
Fair, yeah, I can imagine.
But it was
different
skill set, completely different skill set. But the overriding skill set is still listening, telling the story, making sure it's coherent, and putting out.
My gosh, I feel like I need to give you like a moment for like people to just give you an applause, because what a world you guys lived in and navigated. It makes me, as the 2025 journalist, right, very appreciative of what I have. Honestly, even, of course, we were speaking fairly recently because, guys, Bola has presented a program that I've been presenting. It's a radio show. She's presented a lot, like I said earlier, but she's presented Focus on Africa, and it was live. And Bola said, when I told her, oh, I've been doing this, she's like, I wish it was live. I was like, why are you wishing that on me? Because even, when I've been doing it now, it's pre-recorded. Even that has its own challenges. And then I have had a few older journalists as well who've come and they're like, oh, wow, great, well done. They're like, I wish it was live. I'm like, what are people trying to wish on me now?
No, there was an excitement, Nyasha. It was just, the program would be on air and there would be breaking news. There's nothing like breaking news. I loved breaking news. My God, if it
My
was...
heart would be beating.
Oh, no.
So I'm like, what words do I use?
It. It would come to you because you'd know the story. You would know, if there was a coup. And this was the beauty of, you asking one of the nice things about working in Bush House. And I think it's the fact that or working in the African service, and even you felt it, we're family.
Oh, yeah.
But not only you're a family, you're a team. And everybody's skill set in your family, in your team. So when when a story would break like that, you would know who would, and the editors would know, and but as a team, you would know who would do what, whose skill is, and so-and-so would be bashing the phones to get somebody to talk about, we need an eyewitness to talk about it. So you would call your correspondent who would then get but you on the ground, you'd be fed in the ear by the studio manager and whoever's producing you, telling you, okay, we're going to so-and-so next and blah, blah. Oh, there's a buzz. Yeah.
Wow.
No,
wow. Hey, I hope you are enjoying this episode of With Nyasha Michelle, but I did have to interrupt you a little bit to remind you, are you subscribed? I know you're enjoying the content, so make sure that you subscribe, but also don't forget to like, share, and comment. Put something in the comments there. What's your favorite bits? What's the bits that you don't like? Who do you want to see me talk to next? All right, you can go back now. So then, speaking of that buzz, what is one particular day where you had to report on something, or something happened, or it was a breaking news, or a coup, or a big name that you spoke to that you're like, that day, Nyasha, I'll never forget?
Oh, there've been too
I know
many.
there's a lot.
Yeah, there've been too many. Even talking about your country, let's talk about when Robert Mugabe accepted that he was going to step down. You remember there'd been such a build-up.
Yeah.
And, Mnangagwa, you didn't know, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And whatever. And then we heard this news and we were on air at the time. And then the news broke. And we went live to Harare already, I think, because we already had a team on the ground.
Yeah.
And it was Connie Sharp.
Connie. Yeah, because she's told me actually.
Yes, it was Connie Sharp. It was, trying to remember who else from the African service. Connie Sharp, but it was definitely Julian Keane, my old, beautiful brother, who may his soul rest in peace. We were together on Newsday. We started, as we're sitting now, sitting up, co-presenting. And we went to both Carney and to Julian, and they were just giving us, and it was just, you could tell the swell of emotion.
buzz.
You imagine since 1981, and people, have never known anybody
any other
but
president.
this man, and all of a sudden, you're hearing that he's fallen, and people couldn't believe it, and just seeing. So on the one hand, because we're radio, obviously, we then had to retell what we could see on the screen. So that's the beauty of radio as well. Is bringing a story alive.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I think radio is so immediate in that sense that, you're telling a story for people who don't have the chance to be there or see the pictures. So you're then telling them what you can see, and you're telling it through words and through what other people are telling. Yeah, but there are too many.
Yeah, I can imagine
events.
that. I would be unfair if I forced just one on you, because you were doing this for a while, like 31 years, and it's very clear. I don't need to ask you. It's very clear. You're very passionate about it. Is there ever a day where you had an experience that changed or pivoted your perspective on the industry positively or negatively? One thing that you're probably like, I love what I'm doing, or another day where you're just like, hey.
Okay, I'll something that was, it was more just when you were asking earlier about the kind of challenges. Was this was in 2000, and I was doing the Story of Africa history series, and I was co-producing along with another producer, David Stead. He was the executive producer, and there were just the two of us initially producing it, and then a couple of others joined us, but we were the ones who went out. And I mean, for me, it was a fantastic opportunity. I went to West Africa, and I also went to Nashville and went to parts of Kenya as well in order to, and it was just fantastic pulling together these stories, because I went to, slave forts. I went to, I went to where the Dowels would come in Mombasa. I spoke to Professor Ali Mazrui. I went to Elmina Castle. I went to Badagry in Ghana. I went to Nigeria, Badagry, all sorts of different things. But when I went to Mali, that's where I had the biggest challenge. I thought, hey, what am I doing? So what had happened was that there was an airline at the time which people called Air Peut-être, that Air Maybe, because sometimes you book your ticket and then on the day that you were supposed to travel, they would say, maybe you will travel, maybe you won't travel because there's something. So anyway, I had one of those. I can't remember what had happened, but something happened to that airline at the time. And so I couldn't travel by air, but I only had a set number of days, and my connections had been, because I was traveling I was going to Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Mali, to cover different aspects of history. And I was going to Mali in order to see the mosques in Djenné, and to travel to different regions, to also go to Timbuktu to see the manuscripts. It was Nyasha. That was an experience that really to this day it's had an impact on me in a positive way. But there was a negative aspect when I was traveling from Bamako to Djenné, and couldn't get a flight, and I then had to go by road, and I traveled with a gentleman who didn't speak English, and my French was very, very minimal, and we went by a 4x4, and we went, I think it was an 8-hour or 7-hour drive. Wow. This man, I don't know how he did it. He was like a homing pigeon, because at times we were like in the desert. Yeah. I swear to God, all I could see was sand. Yeah. Left, right, forward, back, sand. This was with a man I didn't know from Adam. He didn't speak English. I spoke basic French. And you know what kept us going? Reggae music. This man had a cassette in his car, and he played from Peter Tosh. I think we repeated the cassettes on, and I may have had a cassette as well, because I think at the time, this was before you had AirPods or whatever. I think I may have had a Sony Walkman. Do you know what a Sony Walkman is? My God. Yeah. Wait. I know. You don't know cassettes? You don't know LPs?
I do know, by the way. Wait.
Your parents would have had a Sony Walkman.
Are those the ones you have?
You had headphones and you had a cassette.
Cassette or CD? Cassette. Oh yeah. The one. Wait, hold on. Let me tell you. Actually,
yeah, go on.
Because I actually do know them, because those are the ones that would, after a while, they go.
Yes,
and then
the cassette would unravel.
And then you have to take
exactly.
a pen and.
Yes, exactly. Okay, sorry, I apologize. But the Sony Walkman was your personal one, and back in the day when that started, it was like, wow.
Oh, the thing.
You were so cool. Yeah, I had a red one, I remember, and I can't remember if I started. I mean, by that stage, actually, I'm wrong. By 2000, I think we had started having mini discs.
Yeah.
I think, because I think I recorded part of that series on a mini disc, I think, or on Marantz. Anyway, to cut a long story short, this man had a cassette in his car, and between his music and my music, and I was R&B, I wasn't really into reggae, but he was really into reggae, and that's how we survived. Wow, if any child of mine would tell me that they would travel for 7 or 8 hours over a desert, and I couldn't...
With a stranger.
And there was no mobile phone where I could then phone and say, because there was nothing like, internet signal or anything like that. So I had to wait until I reached my next destination to send emails to family and send, there was nothing like being out on the road and getting Wi-Fi signal and sending messages. You imagine?
Well,
so that I did think at the time, I thought, Yeah. Am I wise?
But you're here.
I'm here.
We
Yeah.
thank God. So that is an experience that, even though it was negative in terms of what happened with this airline, maybe, I
Yeah.
would imagine that it was actually like a positive thing.
In the end.
In the
Yeah, yeah. In the end.
Well, thank God the reggae man was not a serial killer.
I wish I could remember his name. No, because obviously I mean, I'm saying it like that. It's not as if I just hopped into a car with somebody. I obviously got people to vet.
Yeah.
And it's like back in the day, that's what you did. It's not that you're looking somebody up to see what their advisory,
Nowadays,
review
I can
is.
go ask
It's-
ChatGPT, do you know?
Exactly.
And then it was searching the web.
Yeah, I mean, we relied, even for our journalism, we relied a lot on trusting people.
Yeah.
Talking to people, and there's an immediacy with picking up the phone and speaking to somebody, sometimes for a long time, just to get a germ of information. It was a different era. And as I say, you didn't have every Tom, Dick and Harry also then challenging because they've got their mobile phone and they've recorded it before you even, because they're there. They're not a journalist though, but they're recording the story and giving their own version. Wasn't like that back in the day. It was, yeah.
Wow. You had some experiences.
But then remember, also back in the day, we had the challenge of, we were trying to, and I'm not saying we as the BBC, I just mean as in African journalists and journalists on the whole, we were now up against governments that, have been very tight with the way information is shared or the kind of information that is disseminated. So, and it was also at an era where multi-party democracy was just starting up.
Yeah.
And it was, and that was why for us in the African service, it was not our heyday, but that's why people turned to the BBC a lot, excuse me, because they felt, okay, we'll get objective news from here. And it wasn't just because of us in London, it was the reporters on the ground. Yeah, it was the reporters on the ground who were doing the heavy lifting. We were just there to share the information they were giving us, and also speaking to the different politicians and different sides. And it was getting those that you had to depend on the people on the ground or get the numbers of people that you needed to speak to.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's been so fascinating hearing your stories. I feel like my life is not as adventurous at all
Oh, no,
anymore.
it is. It is.
My journalism, maybe not as much. But I do want to get to know you outside of journalism. So tell me, who is Bola outside of being a storyteller, being a broadcaster? Tell me about your family. What are your hobbies? What do you like?
Oh, where do I start? Okay, I'm a mum. I'm a wife. I have 3 kids. I say they're kids, but yeah, I mean, your kids are always your kids, no matter how old they are. So I have twins. They're 24, and I have a 17-year-old. And my husband, and I'm the third born. My mum is still with us.
Love that.
She's fantastic. She's, one of my, I mean, as well as my kids and my husband, she's, my biggest supporter, I think. And I think, as I say, she's the person who recorded me when I was 8.
Yeah.
And she's still, my biggest champion, or one of my biggest champions. And my dad was as well. He'd always say, whatever you put your mind to, so I've always had that. Yeah, I've come from a very supportive family, and I have a very supportive family, and I think family means a lot to me. What else did you ask? What do I like doing?
Yeah, hobbies.
Apart from talking.
Yeah. And you do that very well. And it's nice that you get paid for it.
Yeah, too much. I still like talking. I like talking to people. Yeah, maybe it's because I'm nosy, I think. Yeah, because I like
helps,
hearing.
though. Yeah.
It does, but not everybody likes it when you talk to them. No. I like stories. I love hearing stories about people's family, Nyasha. Seriously. So one of my pet things, and my family kind of think I'm a bit quirky with this, especially my children. I love heritage stories about when you have long lost family.
Yeah.
People who've been separated from their family, and then after 27 years they come back together, or people who were adopted and didn't know what their heritage is, and they use DNA to trace it. If somebody would tell me, Bola, you can present one of those programs,
Oh.
I would be in heaven. but I would also like to do the reporting to find people. So I'm very interested in genealogy. I'm interested in food.
Yeah.
I love music.
We've learned that
Love
now.
music. No, I love music. Music. I don't understand people who don't listen to music, and there are people who don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
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 I don't know. Who's one of your all-time greatest?
Oh, there are too many. My all-time great. Yeah, I don't even know how to choose. It's funny when you put somebody on the spot and ask them to list all their all-time favorites. They kind of. So I'm trying to think who at the moment I'm listening to. Okay, let me think who I'm listening to at the moment. It varies because
Yeah.
I listen to a lot of R&B. I listen to, I mean, a lot of R&B. I listen to a lot of neo soul.
Yeah.
I'm not so into juju music. Okay, before I used to like Adekunle Gold is good.
Oh,
Yeah,
you've
and he's got a
interviewed him,
new.
haven't you?
I have interviewed
Yeah.
him twice, in fact, and I'd love to interview him again. And he's got a new. He's kind of switching things up because I think he's doing something with either the Guildhall musicians. He's kind of putting an orchestral twist to his music, which when you fuse his kind of soft, mellow
Yeah.
juju with his,
Yeah.
is really really nice. Yeah, I have varied.
I like the mixture.
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
mixture. Then I love artists like Estelle. She's got a fantastic new album out. And
didn't
one of
know
the
that,
songs, yeah, and one of the songs. Okay, the song that I now use for my alarm isn't the latest Estelle song. It's called "Oh I."
Okay.
Please, when you
Then
finish,
I'm
listen.
going to
It's
listen to it.
It's just got to be. She's African.
Yeah.
Don't you? Yeah. So I love Estelle. I love people who fused. I love Jules. Yeah, if I have Jules in my ear, I love he's got a song that he's done with Masego.
Ah.
It's called Perspective. That's my kind of vibe. I love
Okay.
that. And then I also love gospel. So it's a mixture of, if you give me Kirk Franklin, I can listen to him until the cows come home. So yeah. So I have very eclectic taste, I
Yeah.
think, for want of a better word.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's really good to find out about that aspect of you because, of course, I just knew you from work.
Yeah.
And then just going back to work, BBC, you stepped out of the doors after 31 years. I mean, I've seen you come
Yeah.
back, pop back in once or twice, but you left after 31 years. What was it like? Just give me like what's on your mind about like what was it like for you? What were the highs? What were the lows? How did you feel when it was like, okay, this is it? Like the past 31 years of my life, I'm going into a new era now.
It was strange.
Yeah.
I won't lie to you. It was so strange, Nyasha. It was a whole shift. You imagine and I did night shifts for a long
Yeah, I
period.
know.
I think for 25 of those 31 years,
And how do you still look good like
I did
this?
night shifts. My sleeping pattern is still not so hot, I have
Ah.
to tell you. Only because I think you become so used to
Yeah.
having to surviving on short sleep. And even when I did my night shifts, there are some people that are so lucky. My husband is somebody that if he's tired, he can just knock off like that.
That's
Even
me.
standing up, he can see, that kind of thing. But no, I would need total silence. And even with total silence, my body I couldn't really get that rhythm properly, even after years of doing night shifts. So that was hard to so that was something that when you've been doing night shifts for so long and then you're now, but it was hard, but it was also wonderful. Not
really?
having to think that, oh, I'm going to sleep and in a few hours time I'm waking up. When everybody is going to sleep, you're waking up to start your shift. I did night shifts where I would wake up at 11 in order to get into work for 12:30. I did night shifts where I was waking up at 1 in order to get to Bush House for 3. By the time Newsday finished, I was waking up at 1:30, and I lived outside London. So to get so there have been so many different shift patterns, but they've all destabilized my metabolism in some way. So that was wonderful. not to have to do night shifts in that sense. But I missed the family that we had
Yeah.
in the Africans. There's nothing like it. And I think we've been spoiled working with that group of people. Though luckily, I'm so happy because I'm still friends with a lot of them. So we, as family, we still kept in contact.
Yeah.
A lot of us keep in contact, and it's so nice. Even people who left 10 years ago, we're
Yeah.
still friendly now. But it was also the routine, and it was also not speaking to your listeners.
Yeah. How did that
was
feel?
very strange, because I loved my job.
Yeah.
I think I was really lucky in that, and that's why I think I was telling you about the live element. There's nothing like a live program. It was just I loved being on air, whether it was Focus, Network, or Newsday, and getting a text coming in. And the text started on Network Africa.
Okay.
And we would get the text and you'd see them on the screen. And in real time, somebody is telling you, Nyasha, that comment that you made was really silly. And you could then respond
back
immediately.
Wow.
And because Network was such a laid back program, it was news and current affairs, but we had an element of where you could ad lib, say your own thing, and you built a relationship with the listeners. And it was just, you had that, you had that opportunity to, talk to people, and you built a rapport with them. And we used to get regular texters. You would know whose number. I could recognize people's numbers.
Wow.
After a while, you knew who was texting
some
you.
people are very loyal.
And then, and the same happened on Focus, same happened on Newsday, that you would have certain people who would always, sometimes it was the same old, but it was just, that interaction with listeners and knowing that you're speaking to people, was, it was just, there's nothing like it. Going on, I don't know if it's happened to you, but you would go on travel somewhere, be posted somewhere, and someone would come up to you and say, by the way, I had there was a minister that I was speaking to in Zambia. And after we did the interview, we were talking about young girls and child marriage and how to stop child marriage. And after we finished, she said, I'd just like to introduce you to somebody. And I said, who? And she said, oh, that man over there. Went up to this man, handsome, gentleman, going great at the temples, what have you. And I said, hello, sir. And she said, oh, now meet your rival. And I said, sorry, what? And she was talking about herself.
Yeah.
And me being her rival. She said, because her husband would sleep with me. He would go to listen to Focus on Africa as he was going to sleep, and then wake up with Network Africa. She said that the radio was under his pillow, and that she said, you're with me all the time, that, I sleep with you, I wake with you. And so we laughed so much.
Funny.
But, that's how much of we became a staple in people's lives, and it was just lovely meeting people. I remember Liberia is where I felt that the most. I went to cover the elections. I think was it 2019? Forgive the year if I'm wrong. But we went. I've never experienced this. I've experienced it elsewhere, but not to the same extent. That we would say where we are. I went with a guy called Neil. This was on Newsday, but I was covering for both Newsday and Focus. And we would report from a place. Half an hour later, for the next Newsday, somebody would come and say, I heard you in the first edition, and I'm here. This is my name, blah, blah, blah. And they would travel.
Wow.
Travel. There was one guy who, I don't even know whether he walked or whether he took a bus, a moped or what have you, and just to say hello. And people were doing that all the time. And that's just something, it's just wonderful.
Yeah.
So that kind of interaction, you'd miss. But it was also nice to know that, that you'd had an impact, or even not an impact, that you touched people and you had this relationship with people.
You had an impact.
So that's been a transition. And also just not, trying to find now where you fit and and I still like telling stories. Now, though, I have more room, more free time to do the things I love doing that are my choice, not an editor's choice. So I love doing reports on the arts. So I love facilitating, and doing panel discussions, moderating. So that's something I have room to do, which I didn't have as much room to do,
Yeah.
if at all, for Focus or Network or Newsday whilst I was at the Beeb. Now I can do it. But yeah, it's now you have to make a name for yourself by yourself as
Yeah,
yourself. So
right.
that's that is it's a challenge. And also because I worked in radio. I wasn't, that's why I was telling you about Instagram is kind of quite hard for me as well. Putting yourself out there is not as easy for also people of my generation as well.
Oh,
So
it's amazing. You did so much more than I think you realize. I know that the impact that you had the ability to be able to get that sometimes instant feedback from people. But honestly, you did such a massive thing for so many people, the listeners, the people in Africa, people like myself. And so you've got me, young journalist, 2025 journalist, and then you have so many years in the industry. So, what's one piece of advice that you would give someone like myself? And I particularly mean a black journalist, male or female, and even someone as well who's also African. What type of advice would you give to us?
for a woman, for a young woman in particular, perseverance. And I say that because if you're back at home, you even need, I think, a harder backbone sometimes because you're dealing with still with a lot of patriarchy. Even though here it's the same thing, and here it's hard as, I mean, different. It depends where the person is, because here you also have the old boys club,
Yeah.
or the network, and it's hard to break into sometimes. You know, whether it's the BBC, whether it's, you know, here in the UK, you know how many sectors don't have people who look like us.
Yeah.
The beauty is that now you have social media and you can make a name for yourself. And also through social media, you can make connections. So I would say people should really reach out to people. I know it's hard sometimes because, you know, depending on who you're reaching out to, you don't even know how they're going to respond to you.
Yeah.
You know, but hoping that you will meet somebody who will be willing to open their door and, you know, let you in and take you under their wing. I was discussing this with your producer, actually, Rihanna, saying the same thing. You know, we had this conversation earlier because it is something that you have to find somebody who you can
Yeah.
trust and depend on.
Yeah.
But also write. You know, if you have a story to tell, you know, somebody even said this to me, you know, that in a way to get out there, especially for people that don't know you, if you have something to say,
Yeah. Say it.
start writing, but also try and get your articles published. There's nothing like being a journalist and writing, you know, because so many people, every Tom, Dick and Harry now feels they have something to say and can do a podcast or go on, you know, and utter words of wisdom. And, you know, so many people are doing
Yeah.
that. Not that I'm saying that it's wrong for everybody to do a podcast, you know.
No,
I
I
want to do a
understand.
podcast of my own, but it's, you know, it's also having something of import to say.
Yeah.
You know, write
Agreed.
articles, also try and get, you know, but also perseverance, you know. And I know it's hard, but, you know, trying not to take no for an answer, or if you take no from somebody, go elsewhere. You know, alliances are good. It's nice to see that there are, you know, more organizations, black journalists, you know, there are you know, different sectors, whether you're in audio, whether you're in television, whether you're in print, there are more people who, you know, are grouping together to give themselves that solidarity, because it does make a difference to know that you're not alone.
It does.
But to try and find mentors who are longer in the tooth, who've been doing it for a while, and don't always think that you're going to find allies who are that it's just black
Yep. Just because they are. Yeah.
editors who are going to be in your corner, because sometimes we've been our own worst enemy. There are people I know who've climbed up a ladder and pulled the ladder up after them.
Yep.
So see what their track record is. But yeah, just and have a story to tell. Know what area you want to. It's not. So many people. I mean, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but so many people would say they are journalists, and you kind of wonder, okay, what do you write? What do you do? What is your area? What is your, or what area do you want to get into? And prove it. And try and work at that. But yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. There's one question, though, that I felt I asked, but I feel like I want to just ask this properly. Maybe I didn't. Someone might even say I didn't. I probably didn't. But I want you to tell me, Bola, what was it like being a journalist, a Black African journalist, a woman as well? Throughout your career, what was it like being a Black woman at the BBC, being a Black woman in the industry?
In the African service, it was good on the whole, but there were also challenges with getting heard. Sometimes, I remember when we were, even in Bush House, this used to happen. Sometimes you go for editorial meetings in different sections, not in the African service, and to be noticed in a room, you think, but I've said exactly what this person has said, and I said it before them. How come you're only listening to what they're saying? Yeah. And yet I said exactly the same thing, but in a different way. All of a sudden, Mr. Tate is saying it and you're listening, or you know what I mean? So that was quite frustrating at times. I mentioned the issue of sometimes even our own people sometimes didn't make the situation better. Dealing with sexism, you have that whether you're at home, whether you're here, people who would not, who would discount you because depending on what area you're in. I mean, I think for sports journalists, it was even harder.
Yeah.
You can imagine what they went through. But even being in political situations and having to jostle, if you're in a campaign and you're covering a campaign and trying to get to the front and, sometimes, but I know that even now that's still a situation that, happens. But I was in radio, so a lot of the time I was kind of shielded from that, being on the, being on the ground and facing that. But yeah, there was still, it was tough. It was tough. I remember one editor when I first started, who remained nameless. But I remember one editor when I started and I wanted to get into presenting, and he said to me, "Oh, but Bola," he said, there are so many people who have just left the London School of Economics or SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, and they've come out with an African Studies degree, and they've come straight in and they've come in as producers. Why should we give, you who started as an editorial assistant when these people?" And I said, well, one, because I'm African, and two, because I've lived the story of some of these people, but also I know the story on the ground, and I'm a good journalist. So why wouldn't you give me? So sometimes that was right at the beginning that I dealt with, that kind of ignorance, I would call it. But, the ignorance comes in many forms, and we also struggle to get, I think, not just I think even as a service, sometimes we had to get the recognition that we, were due. But, even just for people to realize that, hello, without programs like Focus on Africa and Network Africa, you wouldn't have even had the millions that listened to the African service that boosted the numbers of the world service at one stage. So that was, really, really frustrating that we didn't sometimes get that recognition. But as individuals, that happened as well, that you would sometimes be overlooked. And it also happens not just as a young journalist, even as an older journalist, sometimes the face didn't fit. Because, then they wanted new models, as time went on, it then reversed, that, Yeah, so it's been varied. But it's because I'm so glad that you wanted to concentrate on the positive, because I think I've not buried the negative, but sometimes you have to ensure that the negative doesn't override
Overshadow.
and
Yeah.
overshadow,
Yeah.
so that now it's like, you know what, that's happened. I know I did my bit
Yeah.
in terms of trying to champion our voice,
Yeah.
the voice of, our people. And, you know, I did my bit challenging a few people and rubbing a few people up the wrong way and being penalized for it. I know that happened a few times, but that's their own cross to bear.
Yeah.
I have nothing to be ashamed of in terms of speaking up for my people in whatever way that happens, whether it's speaking on behalf of my people on the ground, speaking on behalf of our listeners, speaking on behalf of our service, our programs,
Yeah.
And I think we did that in a spirit of solidarity. So you knew that there were people who had your back.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh gosh, Bola, I have enjoyed every moment of this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And
I've enjoyed it too, surprisingly, because I was scared.
I know you were. And I was like, don't worry. If there was anything that you weren't comfortable for us to have a conversation about, I would have been okay for us, to not talk about it. But I don't want to go into that. Me and you would talk afterwards. I'm really grateful to hear that you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
And I hope some of you guys, well, not some, but all of you guys actually valued and took something from this conversation, even though we're in different specific, But in fact, that's why it's even better. That's why it's even better. But before we wrap up the podcast, we have a segment called Pass the Mic. So a previous guest leaves a question for the next guest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you have the privilege of answering a question from actually a fellow Nigerian woman.
Okay.
She is a musician and her name is Shei Shei. And she asks, her pass the mic question is, what would you tell your 13-year-old self?
Oh, my goodness. 13-year-old self. Don't be too shy. I was kind of shy. It's funny. Yeah, I talk a lot once I'm comfortable. But also when in radio, you had the benefit of not seeing
people. Yeah,
that's true. So you have that sense of it gives you a bit of cushioning, a bit of security. But not be too shy. To be proud of myself, maybe.
Yeah.
And to not lose sight of my dreams, and also not to procrastinate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd tell myself that not to allow things to. Yeah, and to go for to go for things.
Go for it.
Go for it. Yeah.
Love that.
Maybe. Yeah.
Now you get to pass the mic. What question would you like to leave?
But you see, this is a very hard thing, because who am I leaving the question for?
That is the beauty of this. You don't get to find out until the next episode comes out, and I'll tell you, oh, you know your question. Here's the person. This is what they answered.
Okay. What piece of advice were you given by a parent or somebody you looked up to as a parent that you've retained to this day?
Very good question. I'm actually going to think about that, because I've had different conversations with both my parents, and I wonder what's one.
It doesn't have to be one.
Yeah. There's quite a good amount. Yeah. My mom, she would definitely be like, yes, I'm the one who told you that. Tell them.
My dad always used to have a saying that he'd tell me if I were not complaining, but if I was saying, "Oh, but Dad, it's just not happening." My dad has passed. He passed in 2023,
Oh, I'm sorry
shortly
to hear.
after I left the BBC. In
Oh.
fact, yeah.
Mm.
So he used to say, "Ẹni tó bá pẹ́ jẹun kì í jẹ bàjẹ́." So apẹ́ kó tó jẹun kì í jẹ bàjẹ́, and basically it means that if you, this is in Yoruba, it means that if the person who's waited a long time to eat is not going to eat spoilt food. If you've waited this long, you're not going to take any rubbish at the end of it. It's basically perseverance. Yeah, it's perseverance. It means stick to your guns. Don't say at the last minute is not the time when you're suddenly going to be changing what you've been striving for all that time. Wait it out, be patient, and it will happen.
You know what? That is amazing, because I've taken that on for myself. There's so many, quite a number of different things that I felt like, oh, you know, and this has come at the right time.
Yeah.
So thank you
and
very
have
much.
faith.
And it's part of that.
With God, all things are possible.
Oh,
Yeah.
amen. God is
Yeah.
working, guys. God is working. Hallelujah.
Amen.
I am so thankful again
Thank you,
that you
Nyasha.
came. And, you know, we've had a really interesting conversation. You've taken us back down the memory lane, or your memory lane, rather.
You've made me laugh.
Uh,
I'll never forget the Sunny Walkman.
yeah, I was like, wait, which one? But again, thank you so very much. Now,
Thank you.
I am going to ask you to do something, and you can only do it. You can do it only if you feel comfortable.
Okay.
Right. You know, you spoke about the whole Instagram thing.
Yeah.
Now building your name and, you know, being out there. I know there are some people who've watched and listened who've been inspired by you, and they may want to get in touch or just kind of follow your life and your journey now that you are in this new season of your life. So if you would like to, you can talk to them in that camera and tell them where they can find you.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, cool.
I'm a bit shy, but I'll say it. Yeah. Do I introduce myself?
You just, you know what? Do it whichever way you're comfortable.
Okay. So I'm Bola Mosuro, and if you do want to find out more about me, what I'm doing, what I've done, and what I'm still doing, as Nyasha said, in this new season, you can follow me by looking at my journey on my website, which is bbwithb.com, breakingbreadwithbola.com, and I'm also starting my own podcast called breakingbreadwithbola.com, where I'll be speaking to people about things that matter in their life, periods in their life, that have really been pertinent to their story, to do with their heritage, their culture, their family, but also a dish that corresponds to that period and why it's so important to them. So I hope you join me on my next journey, my new chapter, and my new season, Breaking Bread with Bola.
Oh, that is perfect. I love that. That is a great concept, guys. You heard. Please just go and support her. Awesome. Guys, I hope you have enjoyed that conversation as much as I have. But do not forget, I have sat down with so many more other incredible people. So do go and watch or listen to season 1 and season 2 that was in South Africa, whilst I then work on bringing you yet another season. I have to thank you guys for staying with me all the way through to here. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't. Make sure you drop the comments and let me know who you want to see. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for the love. Season 3 has been phenomenal. I hope you've enjoyed the people that I've brought to you. And I will be back very soon with more incredible guests. If you guys also want to keep up with what I'm doing, you can follow me at Nyasha Michelle _ and don't forget to follow the podcast as well at With Nyasha Michelle. Peace and love, guys. Bye.